When Clay said he wouldn't be here this Sunday and asked me if I would preach, and I thought, well, I'll just add one more into that series of sermons that he'd been doing in October based on the question, why? And this morning I want to raise the question, why church? Why is the church important or needed in our world today? What is the church? And seeing how it has changed so very much over the years, what is it about the church that is still so vitally important in people's lives in the modern and so-called post-modern world? Recently, I celebrated my 71st birthday. Now, I hope that's hard for you to believe, because it sure was for me. But I don't know why, but shortly thereafter, for some reason, I woke up at 3 o'clock in the morning, and I kept thinking about all the changes that have taken place in the church during my life since I was a child, and especially speeding up since I began my ministry, the changes take place. In fact, my colleagues in ministry who are my age agree with me that the church today is not the same as the church that we served for so long. How has it changed? And are those changes really important? What I want to share for the next few minutes might seem to some of you who are old enough to remember all these changes a quick trip down memory lane. For the rest of you who are not old enough to remember these changes, you're probably going to say, "Are you kidding me?" But one of the first dramatic changes that I thought of when I thought about how church has changed had to do with the way that people dress when they come to church. When I was a kid, women would wear hats and white gloves to church. Now, I remember that well because one of the ways we got through the sermon was to sit up in the balcony and shoot spitwads off the railing, and you got 1 point for every wad that you could get to stay in a lady's hat. When I was a young minister, the big dress question that came up was whether women should be allowed to wear pants to church rather than dresses. And when one 95-year-old lady in our church courageously broke the barrier by wearing a pantsuit to church, I wrote a column in our church paper and I entitled it, "Panting in Church." And pants seem to appear ever since then. Then there was the debate over leisure suits, and some of you are going, what? Leisure what? Leisure suits. And the question of whether men had to wear coats and ties to serve as deacons. And then there was a whole new world of casual dress in contemporary worship. When I was a kid, people went to church on Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday nights. There wasn't so much competition for everybody's time back then like there is now. And Wednesday nights were mainly for fellowship and potluck suppers. And my dad always told me, "Roy, you know, if you wait till the end of the line, let everybody else go first, you can get as much food as you want. Don't have to worry about taking too much." There were back then what were called the blue laws. Blue laws meant that stores and businesses were not open on Sunday. That was a day of rest and worship and renewal. And God bless Chick-fil-A and Hobby Lobby. They're still closed on Sundays. Sunday school was of great importance 40, 50 years ago. Everybody went to a Sunday school class. And if you had perfect attendance, you get a little round pin that you could wear on your shirt or your dress. And then if you got a second year perfect attendance, they give you a little bar that hung down from that pin. A third year, a bar that hung down from that, and so on. And some of you remember there were a lot of older members in the church that wore their pins very proudly with 25 or 30 bars going down their shirt. And they were as proud of them as veterans are of their medals of honor. Throughout most of my ministry, the church was run by a rather large board because everyone who was an elder or a deacon was a member of the board. and every elder or deacon was expected to be actively involved on one of the committees in the church. And we had 9 particular committees: worship, finance, property, world outreach, community service, evangelism, membership, recreation, and Christian education. And those committees would meet every month. They would come together for about an hour, and they would talk about important matters. And when the hour was up, they'd go, "Time's up," and they'd leave. And they'd come back next month and pick up the conversation where they left off. And nothing ever got done. And that's why we got smart and took up a theme that said, "Out of meetings and into ministry." Denominationalism used to be important too. People would belong to the Methodist Church or the Baptist Church or the Christian Church like they would always drive a Ford or a Chevy or use only one kind of toothpaste. Of course, all of that has changed too. And as far as the church is concerned, I think that's a good thing, because to me, denominationalism divided Christianity according to creeds and doctrines. And now we know that what you believe is not nearly as important as whether you're a real follower of Jesus. And we know that what you know about God or about Jesus is not nearly as important as whether you know God personally. Over the years, there have been big changes also in the mission work of the church, in what we used to call evangelism, in worship styles, worship music, the role of women, and much, much more. But like everything else, one of the biggest changes that has affected the church has to do with technology. And back in the year 1975, I was at a minister's workshop at Lexington Theological Seminary, and they said, "Now we're going to bring in the wave of the future." And they brought in a tabletop computer. And I remember thinking to myself, not during my lifetime. And within 20 years, we had at least 75 computers in our church. Here's another one that the younger generation will find hard to believe, that it's only been in the past 20 years that we've had cell phones. Think about that. 20 years ago, if you had to make a phone call, you either went home and got your landline or you stopped at payphones, if you remember what those were. No texting, no tweeting, no emails, no Facebook, no FaceTime, no Snapchat. Wow, how in the world did we survive back then? Some of us who are older can also remember back in the time before there was widespread communion, how every church had in the pews next to the hymnal a fan. So when it was too hot and there was no air conditioning, you'd fan yourself, and on that fan there was always a funeral home that was advertised. How many of you remember flannel graphs, in which vacation Bible school teachers used to tell their Bible stories before the age of cameras and movies and projectors? So church is different in so many, many ways today. But is all of that really that important? What is important are the ways that the church has not and will not change at all. And one thing that's for sure that you can always depend on, that is always going to be the same no matter how much the world itself may change, and that is God. As the Bible says in many different ways, God is the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. Malachi 3:6, "I am the Lord, I do not change." Psalm 46 tells us that though the world may change, as it does all the time, and at a faster and faster rate, God is still our refuge and our strength. And the psalmist says, "Therefore we will not fear, though the earth should change, though the mountains shake in the heart of the sea, though the mountains tremble with its tumult." Have you ever wondered what that was all about? Well, think about it in terms of earthquakes, forest fires, mudslides, hurricanes, global warming. Think about the mountains shaking in the heart of the sea. Society and culture may change, and certainly really does change from generation to generation. Our culture today is certainly more secular than it's ever been before, but God is still God. The Soviet Union went through 75 years of atheistic communism, but God remained the same during all that time. And you know, the church in Russia today is just as strong as it's ever been. In spite of atheistic communism, the churches were alive, but in different ways when they weren't allowed to do certain things. The power of prayer is the same today as it's always been. It's always been there if you choose to engage it. As Alfred Tennyson once said, more things are wrought by prayer than this world ever dreamed of. But the sad thing is, more things that could happen don't happen because people don't pray. I've always said that the only people who really know the power of prayer and what a difference it makes in life are the people who pray. The truth of the Bible is another thing that doesn't change, whether we pay attention to it or not. Times may change, the world may change, but the Bible's truth about God and about God's relationship with us, human beings, is timeless, eternal, and unchanging. It speaks just as much to our 21st century world and our lives today as it did back in the first century. And it's what the Bible teaches us about life and how to handle life, how to cope with life, that's just as important for us today. And one of those things that it clearly talks about is something called hope, our need for hope. When you combine the unchanging nature of God and Jesus Christ and the Holy Spirit and the power of prayer and the Holy Scriptures, you have a source of hope that nothing else can ever offer. And our world needs hope today. In the face of global terrorism, the renewed threat of nuclear holocaust, political corruption and paralysis in Washington, the rapidly escalating opioid crisis, and the deaths of our young people, we need hope. Where do you get your hope? And how real is it? In the 73rd Psalm that was read this morning, the writer conveys his frustration with the way things are in the world. He just can't understand things. He's basically a good person, but he's troubled and confused, not by the fact that bad things happen to good people, but he says by the fact that people who seem to have no real concern for God seem to enjoy health and prosperity. He says, I couldn't understand this at all until I went into the sanctuary of the Lord to worship. And then he began to see. Where and how do you find your hope when a loved one is dying of cancer, or your child has just been arrested on drug charges, or your spouse says they want a divorce? As the great preacher Harry Emerson Fosdick said almost 100 years ago, worship is the deliberate exposure of one's life to the highest that one knows, and without that capacity, we would be hopeless. Worship lifts us above and beyond the din and the noise, the tragedies and confusion of daily life. It enables us to see the bigger picture, the wider horizons, beyond the ordinary and the routine. Worship refocuses life and releases power and energy that we would not have otherwise. So no wonder the psalmist says he couldn't understand or accept the way things were in the world until he went into the sanctuary to worship. Yet so many people have gotten lost in the midst of life because they've let other activities, far less important activities, crowd out the important time of worship. And so they have no real hope in the storms of life. Besides hope, we also need peace and joy. People today are frustrated and weary and angry with the way that nobody seems to be able to get along with anybody else in our society. And I'm not just talking politics, but everything we hear in the news. And by the way, if you want more peace in your life, just quit listening to the news. But it's also reflected in road rage and uncontrolled anger that's made all the worse today because of the availability of guns to everybody. Do we not get it? Do we not see clearly that the more interest, involvement in religious faith declines in our world, the more anger, depression, worry, fear, suicide, divorce, drive-by shootings, mass shootings, and the drug crisis continue to increase? As Clay wrote recently in a column right after the Las Vegas shootings, he said, there is too much hate, too much anger, too much loneliness, too much fear, too much resentment, too much rage. They are all signs of a nation in a spiritual crisis. Spiritual emptiness, isolation is a universal disease. How are we going to change this? He went on to say it starts with listening to one another, loving one another, serving one another, and respecting our differences. Peace begins in your heart, and it grows from there. And you cannot spread peace in the world unless you first got it yourself. Why, church? These alone ought to be plenty of an answer, but there's still more. Still another response to the question has to do with our need for community. We human beings were created to be connected, not to be isolated and alone. And one of the questions that more and more people ask and even shout out is, does anybody really care about me? And if nothing else, the church is a center for love, for compassion, for caring. Love your neighbor as yourself. That's always been basic to what the church is all about. Loneliness has become a growing plague in our modern society, and people are lonely because they have nobody else that they can turn to for help or for support. Just a couple of weeks ago in our divorce care workshop, and it's the largest one that we've had so far, they were talking about the topic of loneliness, and everybody in the workshop said how lonely they felt since their divorce. And yet they immediately said, but not as lonely as I felt when I was still married and all alone. Loneliness is a growing worry and fear among the elderly, and ours is a graying society today. I can remember a number of years ago, an elderly woman in our church in Memphis lived alone, had no relatives in Memphis, and she died in her apartment over the Christmas holidays, but it wasn't discovered until a week after the New Year. Because of that, we started a ministry where everybody who lived alone that wanted to be involved was paired off with someone else, and every morning at 9 o'clock they'd call each other just to see that they were okay. As long as there is church, nobody has to be alone. And I've often found that the love and the caring in the family of the church, the close relationships, are greater and stronger than even those quite often in bloodline families. People need love. It's the basic human need. And the basic source of love is God. The church is of God. Therefore, the church is all about love. If I had more time, I could go on and on. I'd talk about the innumerable examples of transformed lives that we see in the community of faith. But I hope that I've given you a little time this morning to think about why it is that you come here on Sundays and why the church, although it does continue to change in many ways, is extremely important to the health and the well-being of society. And why, when the church is declining in our society today, if you truly care about the world, not to mention your own children and grandchildren, that you will do your part, whatever you can, to keep the church strong and vital in our society. Like the 73rd psalmist who had trouble accepting and coping with all the injustice and the pain and the suffering and the hurt and the tragedies of the world until he went into the sanctuary of God to worship. So may it be for us. In a world where we have everything to live with, we need to know and be reminded on a regular basis of what it is that we should live for. And keep that in mind, especially when it comes to your children and grandchildren. Why, church? Joy, love, peace, hope, community, and caring transform lives. Need I go on?